let anybody who's gotten lost in. Welcome everyone to tonight's talkback after the screening of The Amazing Life of Margot Heuman. I do hope everyone has had a chance to watch the play. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. On behalf of the library, I'm really delighted to be co-hosting along with the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association tonight's screening and in conversation event. It's particularly meaningful to host tonight's event with director and co-author of the play, Dr. Erika Hughes, led in conversation by Dr. Chelsea Sambells, who is head of research at the HSFA, in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the first transport of deportees to the Theresienstadt ghetto on 24 November 1941. So both organizations, the Wiener Holocaust Library in London and the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association based in Leeds and Huddersfield at the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Center, are charities that focus on Holocaust learning, research, and commemoration. And we base our work on our rich collections of documents and artifacts from the Holocaust period, as well as our personal connections with communities impacted by the events of the Holocaust and genocide. Both the library and the HSFA hold significant collections related to the history of Theresienstadt in particular, and we invite you to visit our websites and our locations, if you can, to learn more about our activities and the material we hold. And both organizations strive to reveal, examine, and honor how historical events reflected in these collections have impacted victims and survivors. The Amazing Life of Margot Heuman presents a remarkable intersection of performance, testimony, historical evidence, and in-depth research as it offers a deeply moving portrayal of Margot's poignant reflections and Dr. Anna Haikova's insightful questions on coming of age as a Jewish queer woman in the concentration camps. It reflects on love, choices, sexual violence and sexual barter, homophobia, and survival, themes that we are grateful to Margot for bravely discussing, to Anna for asking about, and to Erika for portraying so powerfully. So just before I introduce our speakers, just a bit of the usual housekeeping. You will be kept on mute during the formal conversation between Chelsea and Erika, but we will have time afterward for some questions if you have any. And of course, anytime you can just enter anything in the chat. If you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to send me a note and I'll try to do my best to help. I will also turn on the automated caption for those of you who might need it, but just a note that it is automated and so it doesn't always reflect what the speaker is saying accurately. So now to our speakers. Chelsea Sambells is the head of research for the Holocaust Survivors Friendship Association in Yorkshire and a research fellow at the University of Huddersfield. She also manages an interdisciplinary project at the University of Geneva on translation and humanitarian action. Her research chiefly focuses on children, humanitarianism, and war in the 20th century. Her first book, The Exceptional Evacuation, which will be published in 2023, explores Switzerland's Red Cross child evacuations during the Second World War. Congratulations. She will be leading the director and co-author of the play, Dr. Erika Hughes, in conversation. Dr. Hughes is reader in performance at the University of Portsmouth. She is the author of Holocaust Memory and Youth Performance, which is forthcoming from Bloomsbury Methuen Drama next year. Also, congratulations. Her work as a director and advisor of the performance has been seen in the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, Israel, Canada, and Pakistan. She frequently collaborates with both theater companies and non-theater specialists to create performance that is community-based and interdisciplinary. She has worked with a range of organizations, including the US Department of State and the Royal Shakespeare Company, and most recently created a performance for the UN COP26 in Glasgow. She's held fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Freie Universität Berlin, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Technische Universität Berlin, and the Universität Bonn. She is now here with us tonight, as is Chelsea, so I'm going to hand over to Chelsea now. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Christine. Thank you very much to the Wiener Holocaust Library for hosting this, to the HSFA for also participating. So thank you very much, Christine. Really appreciate that. So Erika, it's wonderful to have you with us tonight, and got a line of questions, but I guess I wanted to start with a few comments about the very interesting play, which so many of us have just watched, right? Because it's a love story in the camps, right? That's the one of the chief things that it is, but it's also a bunch of other things too. As I was watching it, a bunch of other themes started to develop. So it's a story of social inclusion, for example, and a feeling of belonging in the camps. One of the phrases that was stated was, "I love Theresienstadt." I mean, whoa. Or, "I was happy in Auschwitz because I had Emma." Whoa. Those are phrases you never ever hear. That is extremely rare. So to hear this sense of social inclusion, very unique. It's also a story of survival. There's a lot of times where the social bonds that she creates with her lover and with her family are what actually make her survive these horrendous and terrible conditions. It's also a coming of age story, an accepting of an adult identity, one that's comfortable with oneself, particularly when others are judging her for displaying love and acts of love towards another woman. And it's also, in a way, it's also a story of conformity and even surrender, where she's feeling in the post-war period that even though she knew she was gay, she really wanted children, and that she somehow owed it to her parents to pursue a heterosexual relationship. So, very interesting, lots of dimensions to this story that are very interesting to sort of go through. So I guess let's start at the very beginning, if that's okay. The origins of the project. Tell us about where this all came from. How did it come to be? And why is there this desire to tell a story about a queer person during the Holocaust?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also just have to echo the thanks to the Wiener Holocaust Library and the HSFA for both inviting me to talk about this play, but I think even more importantly, allowing a forum for Margot's words to be screened and heard. So thank you all so much. So the project started about a year and a half ago, but I guess I actually, it's also a very personal project for both myself and Anna. I've actually known Anna for a million years. She's portrayed in the play, but she and I met in 2010 in at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We were fellows together, and we discovered, I think as a lot of people do who end up at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., that we both had a personal connection to the Holocaust. And so, Anna is the descendant of people who were at Theresienstadt. And my grandfather was in the U.S. Army Air Force and was one of the first medical doctors and the highest ranking medical doctor after liberation at Mauthausen concentration camp. And so I grew up with his stories, but one of my biggest regrets is actually not recording his words. Mm-hmm. And so, so that's been a kind of a life, so that kind of set my kind of, I guess, path in many respects in a really personal way. And Anna, I think, will tell you, that Mauthausen and Theresienstadt are only 300 kilometers away from each other. So so I think, we really kind of bonded over that personal approach, and also an approach to be really frank and honest about the testimony itself, and a real anxiety about over sentimentalization. And so really allowing the specific nuance of survivor stories to emerge, because, ultimately, and as I think you rightly noted, and Margot says some things that you never hear, right? And they're really hard to hear, I think, in many respects, but in no way is she saying those were good places. She's saying she experienced something beautiful in those places, right? Because, those were horrible places. But she herself, was a really brave, amazing woman who had a really human, really natural, normal experience, first love, right? I think many of us can remember that feeling. And so it was a really difficult balance to walk, of course, as we were making this. But that was really the germination of wanting to tell a really specific story that was unsentimental. And then I think we both also were really committed to, there's tons of really amazing Holocaust scholarship, but there was a missing gap, particularly when it came to lesbian, this lesbian narrative. Mm-hmm. And so we felt that it was really our duty, since Margot had given this testimony to Anna, we felt it was really our duty to think about, how to get this story out in particular. And so it was Anna's idea, actually, to make a play about it. She knew that I do performances about the Holocaust, and I've worked with survivors, And I've worked in documentary theater before. And so she actually approached me and said, do you think it's possible? And that's how our journey began. We just started looking at the testimony to see what was possible, and we went from there.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's great. It's often the best when it's an organic sort of thing, right? Not prescriptive and just sort of comes together. That's wonderful. So you mentioned your background a little bit in terms of, you know, why the Holocaust is so important for you, and your grandfather's grandfather's experience at Mauthausen. I mean, it's we all remember stories when we're young being told to us by the older aged groups around us, and we always realized, or we realized later on, that of course, oh, we should have written that down, we should have taken note of that. So what was your grandfather's impressions of Mauthausen, for example? What was it about that was lost to you that became so important to your work?
Well, you know, I think that so much about that story, you know, was actually echoed in the testimony that you do find at the Holocaust Museum. So, you know, for example, and I think in many other, you know, archives and resources. So, for example, you know, one day I was there looking through actually Mauthausen testimony, and I found testimony from a medic, and he very clearly had been in the same unit because he told the exact same story that my grandfather did. And so that space of hearing that from somebody else, I think, was a really powerful one. But the active transmission, and the active transmission in a kind of an intimate visual way was really powerful as well, because I had this is a kind of a wild experience that I had with my grandfather in, I think it must have been 2000. My family gave my grandfather this thing called web TV, where you could plug your old school television into the phone jack, and it was kind of, you know, America Online, that sort of world.
Very cool. Yes. Techie.
And, you know, my grandfather, who was, you know, in his, I guess, 80s at the time, just late 80s, almost 90, or maybe he was 90. Anyway, he was, so we sat down, and I tried to explain, you can look up anything in the world. What do you want to look up? Literally anything in the world, you know, and the whole family's gathered around. You know, everybody was super excited to see my grandfather on the internet. And he said, Mauthausen concentration camp. And I was like, oh, okay. So I typed in Mauthausen concentration camp, and then a map popped up. And then he was able then to kind of give us this, you know, this big old school wooden television. And it was the most amazing family experience, because then he talked us through, you know, seeing that space and that perimeter and being in that space with him. You know, there was something really powerful about having that visual, right? Yeah. In a way that, you know, then I think my aunt and my dad all said, oh, we'd never heard some of those elements before. He talked a lot about the war, but the specifics of the camp history had been really new.
That's incredible.
And so then I just started, you know, and then he didn't, and so, you know, I always kind of thought after that I would record his testimony, and then I didn't before he passed away. But there was something about the intimacy of that moment that kind of, I think, also illustrated to me the power of hearing it live verbally and being in the space of somebody kind of transmitting these stories in a really intimate way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that sense that the personal, intimate experience is so much different than the objective, hard, cold facts, right? And making something like a map come alive just by saying what you remember of that space, you know, that's a really powerful memory. No wonder. And Mauthausen, for anybody that's watching that doesn't know, is in Austria, and it was one that had a stone quarry. And Erika and I spoke about Mauthausen previously, and it's one of those camps that, all concentration camps are horrible, but for terrible, terrible places with terrible working conditions. But for some reason, for me, Mauthausen's always stood out as one of the worst because of the rock quarry. And you see these photographs of the prisoners going up a huge hill with rocks on their backs, and just the conditions, the hard, cold rock. For some reason, it's that one's hard one for me to get around. I can't imagine what that would have been like. That particular kind of labor would have been very stressful, very terrible.
Absolutely. You know, and I think there's certain bits about Margots' story, you know, she wasn't there, but there are certain themes that I think also really echo in the testimonies that I had kind of grown up hearing. So when Margot was talking about, you know, people, you know, really getting sick, trying to renourish themselves after the war. You know, one of my grandfather said one of the things he had to do is actually station people on the perimeter to sort of guard people from kind of taking, you know, food that was rotten or not good anymore, or you know, or eating too much, you know, after you need to reintroduce food after you've been starving. So, you know, so hearing those moments echoed in Margots' story, did feel really, really kind of, you know, personal. And that was one of the things that also emerged in our rehearsal process as well.
Right, okay, brilliant. No, yeah, really interesting. So let's talk about the you know, biggest, most obvious part of this is the fact that it's a conversation between two out lesbians. That's really interesting. Why? Why is that so important to this story? And why? Because I mean, we could have just had a play just about Margot, but what's interesting is involving Anna and the fact that they are both openly gay. So tell us a little bit about that.
So one of, I think, the most important things that we wanted to really capture in this is the idea of the transmission of memory and the transmission of the act of giving testimony and witnessing, so that it's you know, it's not the kind of, you know, sort of verisimilitude of, you know, watching a film and you're sort of supposed to suspend your disbelief and think that you're in the moment. What we were really wanting to emphasize was something that was born out of the fact that Margot, when she had given testimony before about her experience, but she had not given testimony specifically about from the perspective of being, you know, a lesbian Holocaust survivor, and she hadn't talked specifically about what that experience had meant until she met Anna, who is herself an out lesbian scholar of the Holocaust, but who's also, you know, a really kind of powerful voice in queer studies as well. And so it's really, to me, it was really significant that it was a conversation between two women. And so again, this idea of a generational or intergenerational transmission, so that it didn't just exist in a kind of a bubble. But that it was kind of handed to someone who, you know, who also had a lived lesbian experience, which is also, you know, often a narrative that's been, you know, kind of not in the foreground, I think, in a lot of, just in, I mean, societally, of course, but then I think also in scholarship.
Well, it was interesting. There was one moment in the play where when Margot is discussing sexual barter for food, and I'll come back to this in another question I have for you, but she's discussing that, and she's discussing having to be touched by a male, right? And Anna's reaction in the play was, oh, that must have been terrible. And it's, of course it is, because it's not, that's not consensual, even though it's barter, but really that's not a consensual thing. But there was also that added layer that a lesbian would understand, whereas a heterosexual interviewer might not, right? And I thought
I think so. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, but sorry, it sort of slipped through. It was something that was like, oh, okay. You know, like you don't realize your own limitations until you see it not being limited in that way. To see that anyway. So sorry. Yes.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's really, you know, that's really, really true, you know, because I think, I mean, Anna's reaction in the play, but also, I mean, it was directly taken from the testimony. You know, Anna brought gender into that question, right? Is her follow-up. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's about, you know, when you're a researcher, you know, being really, you know, I think, you know, we're really taught to be aware of the, you know, the biases that we have and the assumptions that we make, you know, but at the same time, I think it also really reveals the ways in which, you know, researchers from certain groups and populations, you know, there's an asset there when you understand something of that lived experience already. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right, and I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, no, it was something sort of just like quietly catch in that play. So it was nice to see that come through. Okay, so Margot's testimony is obviously not 45 minutes long. I'm imagining it's a lot longer than that. So how did you take probably hours of oral history and decide what was important, what wasn't important? What was the decision to filter and curate essentially this particular dialogue that she had?
Yeah, it was really difficult, and I like the word curate because I think that's actually really accurate. I would say that's a really good term to describe the way in which we worked. There were hours and hours and hours of testimony, and part of that is because so Margot, Anna interviewed Margot in 2018, both in the United States, in Arizona, where she lives now, and then again in Germany when Margot had gone to Neuengamme for an event, and then was accompanied by her family and asked Anna to join her there, which is where that clip of Margot at the very end of the play on the bed was filmed. But so it's multiple conversations and lots and lots and lots of stuff, and a lot of stuff that is super important and super, really, I think, relevant to who Margot was. We just told one slice of the story, really. But, just like any life, I think what we tried to do, there's going to be so much more than you can encapsulate in any book or any film or any play. And so what we decided to do was we made a difficult choice in many respects so we prioritized her love story. We prioritized, first of all, her being a lesbian, her queerness. That was for us the most important thing in this telling of Margot's life, because that was the narrative that we were, we felt like that was the gap that we were filling. So when we decided that, which was pretty early on, then that was kind of a test that we would sort of hold things back to, and then the working process itself, we would have these kind of these kind of day-long retreats. So we were working both with the testimony, and we were also working with other, and I can talk about this more later, but we were working with other kinds of examples from documentary theater, from which we were drawing in terms of how to stage it, what the form ultimately would be. But then we just had lots and lots of testimony, and we would kind of cut big patches into dialogue. I mean, it was already sort of dialogue, but then we had to sort of shrink it down into more, more back and forth stuff. And then we would read it to each other. We would go back and forth and actually read what the testimony to try and get the kind of rhythm that would work, that would listen well, that somebody could listen to easily, that would be amenable to listening to for a while. And we didn't it wasn't about exposition necessarily, I think testimony, as you know, is often messy. There's stuff that's missing, there's bits and stories and parts that are not necessarily clear. And so we wanted to actually honor the kind of rawness of that. And so there's, I think, a fair bit of, kind of clear exposition that's maybe missing. This is a play that I think is in dialogue with Holocaust studies, not a kind of an entry into what happened, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes absolute sense. Well, it's interesting because, I mean, the dialogue, it's fairly, it's chronological, right? And we know that, which gives the narrative an arc, gives it, right, a predictable progression through a narrative arc. But it's interesting because, of course, memory doesn't work like that. Memory is not chronological. It's very circular. You cut back on yourself. You remember something happened yesterday. You mentioned about the cheese you're going to buy tomorrow, and then all of a sudden you're talking about the Holocaust. I mean, it was everywhere, right? So of course, knowing that, it doesn't make sense to necessarily have it reflected like that. So in which case it was, I think it was a very nice dialogue. You're right or that's not right. How can I say that? I think it's interesting and compelling that you use dialogue yourselves to decide what would sound right in that moment. That's a really interesting process. Did you find that you had to drop a number of things? Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yes. There was tons of stuff, even after we'd kind of edited it down, there were still parts that, and I should say, we never added anything in. So the only passage that's added in is that little video of real Anna.
Right.
But nothing, so everything that's in there is directly testimony. And we haven't even really, we didn't do that thing where we could kind of manipulate even little passages. We just kind of took chunks and trimmed, and then took chunks and trimmed. And then we would kind of skip over maybe a section that was about, as you said, maybe not kind of relevant to the specifics of the story. And then there was also a fair bit that we deleted because it was about other people who, this wasn't their kind of, this wasn't about that story, right? And so we really also wanted to keep it Margot's story, both for Margot and to honor, her story and elevate her story. And then also, I think to out of respect for those people who, it's not about them. And so, but it was really wild because as we were starting to do the reading, I don't think Anna had ever worked this way, and I come from.
I can speak for lots of historians. We don't work like that. Yeah, no, that's a very unusual process and a very innovative one. Yeah.
It kind of, it was when I suggested we do this, she's like, me, and then she's like, maybe my partner should read or something. But it was ultimately, I think, really nice as well, because I think it gave us both a really intimate sense of how that, I think it was really useful for her maybe to feel what it is to read that testimony, right? Because it's it's a really moving thing when you verbalize something. Actors will tell you this, you embody it, and there's a whole kind of tradition of using this kind of work in education, the act of using testimony and speaking with testimony as a learning tool for the person, for the actor. So,
which is brilliant. And I mean, I've got a question about education in a little bit, but let's just stay on this for one more moment. Is that with Anna, like, did you find, because I don't want to pigeonhole either of you into one field or another, you're performance studies, but you're also very much a historian, and she's a historian, but she just wrote a book on Theresienstadt, which has a huge cultural component and an artistic component, so she could be maybe an art history or cultural historian. So
yeah,
don't want to pigeonhole either of you, but how did you find that worked together? Was there tension ever from the scholarly standpoint of trying to mix these fields together? Or was it always really collaborative, or how did you feel about that?
It was really collaborative, and it was a really positive experience. I mean, it's not to say that we always were on the same page about things, and I think that we disagreed plenty, but plenty. But I think that there was definitely enough mutual respect. A, because we're friends, but B, I think we also respect one another's work and expertise. But then C, the third thing I think is that both of us, as you rightly said, I think both of us work really. I think there was a kind of a transdisciplinary component to this, whereas kind of cross or interdisciplinary stuff, kind of maintains the field specific identity. I think transdisciplinary work really kind of melts it together. And I think since we both kind of work in these at the edges of our respective fields, I think it was it felt very natural for us then to try and kind of melt our respective approaches together. And as you said, I mean, we do understand each other's work, right? I mean, I had a couple of postdocs in history, actually, and Anna is actually incredibly well kind of versed in theater, particularly in German theater, and so there was already also some shared vocabulary that we could rely that we could use in our work together.
Which helps, that helps that there's like an overlap. You're two circles, but there's that but there's the bit in between there's that overlap that seems to be nice, productive space. So when let's sort of talk a little bit more about the education component. So So how do you use this process when you're teaching performance studies down south? Like, how does this work to inform a historian? Because I have no idea. This is really interesting to me.
Yeah, so there's I think that there's a couple of ways that you can approach this work, but there's a program out of the USC Shoah Foundation called Eyewitness that has been going about 10 years now, I think. And what they do is they really invite people to students to really develop a super intimate relationship with some Holocaust testimony, that's video Holocaust testimony, and then work with it to make a stage piece, not for kind of big sort of, it's not about the actor performing, but it's about exactly what I was saying earlier, this act of what it is to verbally say the testimony and what that does when you really feel that in your body. And so there's a really great new book, I think it's called Enacting Holocaust Testimony. I know this, but it's late. I'll Google it during Q&A to make sure I get the book title right. Janet Rubin, Arnold Middleman are two of the authors. I'll get the specifics down in just a minute. But that book talks about, it's a really good guide to using Holocaust testimony. And then I think there's other ways as well. So I've been working with a Holocaust survivor. She's in the UK. She actually came to the UK on the Kinder transport, and she wrote a play about her life that she shared with me and another colleague from the English department. And so we have our students read the play, but then I actually work with some of my students and get them to stage just a reading of it. And I would say, this is a reading that you saw today, but even more of a reading, just standing with kind of music stands, a short excerpt of it that for several years now we've performed for local high school students. And then Ruth herself will talk as well. So the two things are working really in tandem. Now, of course, this is, I think we're at a really pivotal moment where we can do that. We won't always be able to do that, sadly, but I think again, it's again, like this moment that I was talking about with my grandfather, it's about connecting the kind of survivor testimony with this next generation of who's going to be carrying this torch of these words.
What's the feedback from students when they engage in lessons like that? Like, what did they say about it?
It's almost overwhelmingly positive. Yeah. And I've done another project actually that it's really mostly positive actually when it's less of a kind of a directed play and more about them developing their own relationship to the testimony itself. So that's something that we tried to do in this play. I would really hope people would think of this not so much as somebody playing Margot or Anna, but rather these people who are performers developing their own relationship to the testimony itself, which is why we've done it as a staged reading, not as a kind of a memorized play. And, I think the other thing, another way that you can approach it, when I used to teach at Arizona State University before coming here, and I worked in the archives. They have the papers of Gerda Weissman-Klein. And she's written a number of really important books about her experiences and her testimonies at the Holocaust Museum in DC. But with my students on that in that class, we worked together and created a kind of an archive experience that people in the community could come in and have an experience going through these amazing set of cards that she'd been given. She's been sent thousands of cards by school children, and then she's kind of written these letters. And so, what my students my students are the ones who decided to focus on this because they were, again, really interested in this idea of communicating the testimony to this next generation. This was something that completely was just rose out of the conversations we had in the class. And so I think it's really largely, it's tricky because of course I think you have to also supplement this with quite a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to learning about the Holocaust, right? So for that class, I made them all read Doris Bergen's book, which I think is a really great introduction, and then a series of, we're reading Holocaust articles, history articles through, and cultural studies articles as well. There's a lot of stuff out of literature studies as well. So they're thinking in dialogue, right? They're thinking about the testimony itself, but then they're trying to understand the relationship of that testimony to the greater history, and then the greater kind of ways in which the Holocaust is represented. Always with the understanding that Kristen Keese has this great quote, there are many ways to represent the Holocaust and all of them fall short. There's no such thing as the kind of one perfect representation of it. But so we're constantly in dialogue with exactly that question or that problem.
No, I really like that. We the thing I'm discovering more and more about the Holocaust, the more and more I study it, is that it has no discipline. There's no way. It's not history, it's not art, it's not social science, it's not human science, it's not medical science, but it could be all of these things in one, and there's no discipline. And what is so lovely about that too, in a way, is that because it doesn't, it's quite liberating to view it in so many lenses, so many perspectives, and so many gray zones, which is a wonderful thing, because it opens up so much conversation and dialogue. And then we see fabulous transdisciplinary projects like yours come to light, right? So it's really interesting, and it's good to know that it has such a positive effect upon students as well, and that it gives them agency and engagement into the actual testimony as well.
Yeah, I think that they really usually end up, my experience has been that, oftentimes they feel like now it's their responsibility culturally to start communicating this story. And I think that's the biggest transition, even the ones who, maybe knew something about the Holocaust, once you've kind of had that experience, then it's really about, now it's on you to keep that story going, and to keep asking the really kind of important questions that we need to ask about why we remember it. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and that's also why, the play about Margot's life will be so popular amongst the younger folk today, right? Because it speaks to their experiences, because being homosexual shouldn't be stigmatized, and it's not, it's far more accepted than it was back 70, 80 years ago. So, Pride festivals everywhere, it's fabulous, right? So that speaks to the growing appeal. But of course, I don't know if a play like this would have been as successful even if you had the testimony 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I don't think we could have had that play at that time, right?
Yeah, I think, and I think that Margot herself, I think, came out later in life for a number of personal reasons, right? And I think, I would imagine, I don't know, I would imagine homophobia was probably, one of them, but I think, with the current students, Aisha, who reads Margot's words, was really, really moved by this, and really honored to be reading Margot's words. She said, because, she is a queer young woman, and she has a daughter, and really, again, this idea of kind of passing on this kind of, intergenerational queer testimony, she felt like, okay, this is a story that also, really, there's something to this that is even more, that is really special and important, because to make sure that, the queer stories aren't just erased, right? It's really combating erasure of these stories. So in that sense, I think there's a political act in doing this, and at least that's how I understand it. I don't want to speak for Anna or other folks, but that's certainly how I understand it.
That's how I would perceive it too. And a long overdue one. These conversations should be happening about the history, and the Holocaust is a horrendous and dark moment and chapter in human history, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't look at it with that microscope from various different perspectives, LGBTQ history being one of them, right?
Yeah. We need to honor everybody who experienced that, like, horrible thing, I think that we really need to honor the range of stories that are there.
I quite agree. So the other aspect of this fascinating play is the fact that the theater has now turned into a place to bear witness and to re-witness a story. And where this stood out for me particularly was in terms of the sexual barter that I had mentioned earlier, letting an SS male guard touch her so that she could basically steal his food, get his food, and then she could go share it with her girlfriend. You know, is this for somebody that's a historian? I know that we often bear witness in various different ways and in various different capacities, particularly in legal settings, right? But in a theater, it's interesting because it's happening communally, right? Do you have any ideas on that or comments on that?
Yeah, you know, I think that, I think this has been really interesting for us because of the way in which, so yes, you know, I think that theater as a space where you bear witness, you're witnessing to somebody, you're witnessing to an audience. And of course, you know, what we would like to do with this play is, you know, once the pandemic is over or endemic, or we figured out, you know, and we're starting to gather again in person, we'd of course love to do a live event, because, you know, as I was saying earlier, that live transmission and the intimacy of that moment is so powerful. And you know, and we've worked with that, you know, in the other projects I mentioned, and, you know, talking about other educational projects that others have done. It's really integral. But at the same time, I think it's been a really interesting experience for us to film this play and to screen it through Brighton Fringe Festival, because then it's been able to reach, I think, maybe an even broader audience, right? And a kind of a really interesting cross section, and bring together, you know, theater brings groups together. Usually it's kind of, you know, geographically determined, right? Because you go physically to a location, right? And of course, you know, Broadway, West End, then you have people coming from all over the world to go to those theaters. But, you know, in you know, I don't know, Findlay, Ohio, or wherever you are, you know, it's really about the local kind of community. But what we've really, I think, appreciated about this experience has been the way in which, and of course, this is silver lining, and I hate the pandemic like everybody does, but it's provided us an opportunity to see the ways in which this active witnessing, I think, can also really serve powerfully through populations that would elect to come to something like this, right? And as well, you know, the ways in which, you know, for example, you know, both, so this event, and then last week we were at the GLBT Historical Society, you know, through San Francisco. And so it's been really fabulous that we've been able to bring Margot's words to these different communities and have these conversations that have been really informed by the different people who've been able to attend them. And then this play as well, we've had a number of colleagues from universities in the US and Canada and in Germany who've asked if they can show it to their classes as well. And so I think that makes me, I think, really excited about the way in which Margot's words and this story then is also actively informing pedagogy, right? So the act of her witnessing is really having an impact on the ways in which you know, fabulous professors are getting to expand the narrative and now have maybe some source material to help them do that.
Yeah, certainly. Well, and you know, what's so great about this project is that, you know, how many times have we all come across witness testimony that just gets to sit in an archive and never be touched and never see the light of day, right? And it can be the most remarkable story, but even though there's memoirs out there that are just beautifully done and nobody reads them, right? There's maybe, but more specifically, what's so great about a play is that you're making it accessible. It's trendy because it's LGBTQ, right? And it's nice and short, right? 45 minutes was 45 minutes. That's very well timed, very clever, because it usually fits into right, the length of a classroom, right? If it was 2 hours, might be a bit more tricky, right? So it was all, it's a very well thought out project from a standpoint of also making it marketable, which at the same time supports this need to bear witness and to share this story. This is such an incredible testimony.
Thank you. Yeah, the decision to make it 45 minutes, it was a really conscious decision to make it under an hour, so that people could, first of all, Fringe Festivals. So that's, I mean, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because there were also some real kind of considerations from the theater world. So Fringe Festivals, if you've ever been to the Edinburgh Fringe or the Brighton Fringe where this premiered, which are the kind of two biggest, but there's tons of Fringe Festivals, all over the country. There are, those festivals are about, they're about an hour, typically the shows are about an hour long, and it's so that individuals can, it's a lot of turnover, it's kind of, you kind of bring a show into a space, but I realize I really respond very well to that length of performance. And so it was a really deliberate decision on our part to think about something that people could get a really intense, we would hope, and quality, we hope, artistic experience in a way that, a shorter thing, I think, allows more people to see it, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's more digestible package, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not I know you're not trying to market it as a commercial product, but at the end of the day, you also probably have to play that game a little bit in order to sell it to the audiences, right?
Well, I mean, you do, there really are, considerations when you're thinking about how to reach an audience. It's I think a really, I think it's a really important thing to really be clear about the fact that it is, it's a genre, in the same way that, like, books, historians write books and you work with your editor, you're probably working with your editor now. I'm working with my editor right now, and they want you to do things like, I had I thought it was a genius title and it was long and wordy. Right. And they said, no, Erika, you have to change it to Holocaust Memory Use Performance. And, because I think they understand their audiences and how to reach their audiences. Yeah. And so as we were working on the script, it was very much that exact kind of consideration. So
yeah, nope, that makes sense. It makes sense. Important. Well, and of course, the last two questions, and of course, again, audience, if you want to ask a question, feel free, just drop it in the chat. But the obvious thing I should point out too is that Theresienstadt had a very rich cultural life. I mean, it had an entire recreation center where, according to Anna's book, they were playing. That they had up to half a dozen different events every single day in 1944 to entertain the members of Theresienstadt ghetto. So, I mean, this is a place with a strong cultural life. There were cabarets, there were operas, there were children's plays, there were concerts, there were lectures, lots and lots of lectures. I didn't realize the extent to the lectures, whoa. Which of course appealed to different kinds of inmates that were within the ghetto. So I guess drawing out those parallels, I mean, does one see the irony of doing a bit of a play on Theresienstadt ghetto when it had such a strong cultural identity at that time?
I mean, I think one of the things that it might be actually that one of the reasons that Margot's testimony worked was so easy in many respects to stage was because of the references to the cultural life. I think so much of that, we've kept so much of that from the play when she's talking about just the being a young person there and what that cultural space was, to be so engaged in that youth community, which was so much about then that rich cultural life. And so that's actually, we really wanted to kind of honor and pay homage to that, which is why we made the decision to have the song be sung. Because of course, that's a very theatrical moment, right? That's one of a couple of moments. Mostly it's reading, and so reading testimony that's in dialogue. But then there are a couple of moments in the play where we tried to kind of like break that and do something very theatrical. And the first one that came to my mind was I knew that I wanted that song. And so then actually it was really great, because then, with working with Aisha, who also played the ukulele, she also transposed the music. She and her partner actually reworked the music for the ukulele.
Perfect.
And she does not speak German. If anybody speaks German, you can tell she does not speak German. But I think that she did a really beautiful job of shaping that song from that cultural space into this cultural space, into a kind of a contemporary, into a contemporary sound. And so it was really, for us, I think, about drawing on that really rich cultural tradition that really persevered and and really thrived in many ways in this horrible space, to show something of that through particularly that kind of very hyper theatrical moment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's and Aisha did a very good job. I thought, even just like when she's just strumming the ukulele, it gives it that sort of almost like a background music effect. And we know that music has such an effect in changing the atmosphere of a room and influencing emotions. So I thought that was a very well thought out use of music at that point in time. So no, I think, and she has a lovely voice to sing. So
I'll pass that on. I'm sure she'll be really, really honored.
Please do. Please do. Yeah. Well, and then I guess the sort of one of the other questions, the last question for you, is about the fact that this is a play. It's not really a historical drama, right? It's not really a documentary, although probably could have been, right? That we get some documentary where we get some original footage put in. We also get the real Anna on a screen explaining a little bit. But like, I guess what is this theatrical tradition? Like, what is this that we're how can we define what this particular project is?
Yeah, so this is a form called documentary theater. And so documentary theater really, there's a really successful, robust tradition of doing documentary theater in Germany. Hans Werner Kosinga is like one of the kind of main, but there are tons. I mean, there's so many really amazing documentary theater directors who, part of the thing is it's the aesthetic of the documentation. And so, the sets are frequently, like ours was, kind of messy, or they evolve with the material that's being discussed, and it's again, it's not about kind of convincing you that you're watching something as it's happening. It's not about that suspension of disbelief. It's about understanding that you're watching an engagement with historical texts on the stage. So he directed, Hans Werner Kosinga directed this one play, Kindertransport. There's a British play by Diane Samuels, a very famous play called Kindertransport as well. But he directed a play also called Kindertransport that was for a German audience. And what he did was he took lots and lots of testimony, but then created kind of 4 composite characters that kind of told stories of so they were, I guess Lawrence Lager, I don't know if you would really contextualize it as this, but kind of a factual fiction insofar as it's a true story. It's maybe just not like the specific story of a specific person. I think at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the exhibit Daniel's Story for young people kind of does this as well, and it was based on just a couple. It was actually, I think we know who it was kind of based on, but but again, it was a kind of a pseudonym / composite character that's really designed to teach a story, but also really evidence and give audiences the or in that case, museum goers, an experience of being in the situation of looking at the historical record.
Yes.
And so there's a really robust tradition in the United States. Anna Deavere Smith is probably, maybe arguably the most famous kind of practitioner of this. And she's looked at a number of really, really important situations in the U.S. American context, particularly the Crown Heights riots and also the aftermath of Rodney King in Los Angeles. And so documentary theater then is really about identifying a real site of investigation that is often still with us painfully. And it's about using the theater as a witnessing space, but not in a clean, easy way, not in a kind of a Diary of Anne Frank, the play/movie kind of way. And there is merit to Diary of Anne Frank, and that's a whole nother conversation. That's a whole nother topic. But this is not that in any way.
The thing that was interesting for me, and it was like, why are they doing it like this? But then maybe it makes sense because it gives, so the fact that they're sitting there reading, like Aisha's reading her dialogue. And I mean, I'm sure every actor is jealous of her for being able to do that and not having to memorize 45 minutes worth of essentially a monologue, right? But the fact, so in one sense, I'm like, okay, why are the actors doing that? Why not just act? Right, without the dialogue. But then it also shows that this is historical testimony, right? And it forces that to confront the audience at the time. So you can't just slip into this dramatized moment, which is a totally different thing. It's forcing the documents to sit there. And it creates an interesting kind of tension. I found myself annoyed that they were there. And then at the same time, you know what I mean? But at the same time, realizing that they're there for a reason, and what's that reason, and am I getting it? You know what I mean? Very interesting, very effective.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there's also a long tradition of Brechtian theater. So using this device called the Verfremdungseffect. Often it's referred to as the alienation effect. I'd probably say it's more like foreignizing, right? But again, that's so exactly that. So you don't let yourself get kind of sucked into this dramatic space that is, you might feel moved, but it's also maybe a little bit lazy. I think Brecht defined it as a culinary, and that you're just ingesting, you're just, and so that space, I think for me, why it was really important for me to have that is because I've seen so many Holocaust plays that ask people to believe that the Holocaust happened because they felt bad when they watched a play, as opposed to really believing the historical record, right? Because I think then, I think you fall into a kind of a dangerous space when it's only about, and that's I think my problem with kind of over sentimentalization of certain narratives. And so I think, for me, it's about exactly that reminder of that important space.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Erika. I think we'll probably wrap it up there, if that's all right. We're 2 minutes over our Q&A, but thank you so much for your insightful answers to our very manyest questions, many of them just made up as I went, just to keep you off guard, right? Really appreciate your time and the fabulous play itself, to be able to see it and participate in learning about how it was created and how it's being received and the reasons for it. Being such an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. And to Christine, of course, thank you very much for chairing and hosting. So appreciate it at the Wiener Holocaust Library and then us at the HSFA. Could we share I guess there's not much point right now at this moment in time because it's just the 4 of us. We don't have the other link that was going to be shared, Christine.